talking about Waste Tide by Chen Qiufan, who I'm going to call Stanley all the way through because I'm much more likely to pronounce Stanley correctly than I am the author's Chinese name. And we'll talk a lot about language over the next hour as part of this book club. So what are we going to be reading today? We're talking about Waste Tide. This is a book published by, as I said, Chen Qiufan, who goes by Stanley Chen Stanley Chan in English, who is a Chinese author, and this book was published in China in 2013, and then published in translation by Head of Zeus in 2019, translated by Ken Liu, who's done a massive amount of work in bringing Chinese authors to Western audiences through translation, as well as publishing his own award-winning science fiction. So I bought this book reasonably recently, and the reason I bought it is twofold, one of which it looked really interesting, and the cover art is absolutely beautiful, which I thought was well worth an investment of my time. And I also bought it because it tied in two themes for me. So the theme of the festival this year, the thing that I'm going to be thinking about, the whole of 2021 pretty much, is representation in the genres of science fiction and fantasy. Who gets published, who tells stories, which stories do they tell, what cultures, what worlds do they conjure up in their fiction. And this kind of thesis that genre has broadened in the last few years and is giving us more and more interesting stories that are being told by authors all over the world and from lots of different perspectives. And the second reason is that I wanted to make sure that we were still thinking about the climate emergency. This is so important to the festival. We talked about it a lot as part of last year's programme, but it's something that we want to continue to think about in subsequent festivals. So climate justice, I think, is one of those ways in, and this book is in a perfect combination of climate justice and science fiction, so it seemed like a perfect book to bring to the book club. There is a spoiler alert, like there is every time. I'm going to be talking about this book in quite a lot of detail, quite a lot of depth. Looking at the reviews, I think I'm actually going to spoil it less than some of the reviews did, but if you are spoiler averse, if you haven't read it and you want to discover it all for yourself as you read it, then go away, read it, come back, contribute to this conversation in the chat afterwards. So, who is this author? Who is Stanley Chan? As I mentioned, he's a Chinese science fiction writer, a columnist, screenwriter, and he's been a professional full-time writer since about 2017. So when this book was published, he was doing it outside of his regular day job. And this was his first novel, following lots of award-winning short fiction. He first came to light with a short story called The Fish of Lijiang, which won a couple of notable awards, and I think piqued the interest of Ken Liu, and they kind of became friends. Stanley was born in Shantou, Guangdong, China, which is going to be important in a minute as we talk about the setting of this book. He went to Peking University and did literature and fine arts, and then studied to be a marketer and ended up working for some massive companies in a marketing capacity, including Google China. And as I mentioned, in 2017, he quit his job to write full-time. And I think from what I can read about him, he's an author that is very interested in things and diving into a topic, researching it, and bringing that research to bear in a fictional universe, which is really cool. So what is Waste Tide about? Well, this is the synopsis. Mimi is drowning in the world's trash. She's a waste worker on Silicon Isle, where electronics, from cell phones and laptops to bots and bionic limbs, are sent to be recycled. These amass in towering heaps, polluting every spare inch of land. On this island off the coast of China, the fruits of capitalism and consumer culture come to a toxic end. And essentially, Mimi and the other workers are, at mercy. They're kind of downtrodden, but a storm is brewing because the Americans have arrived, and they want to professionalize the waste management system and turn it into a business, removing the kind of clan gang culture from the conversation, and essentially making it more of a Western approach to a problem that the Western world has, in large part, created. And these forces all collide over the course of the story, and they give us some interesting things that go on between the two. And the synopsis ends by saying, a war erupts between the rich and the poor, between tradition and modern ambition, between humanity's past and its future. Mimi and others like her must decide if they'll remain pawns in this war or change the rules of the game forever. So it's a kind of eco-techno thriller, really, but also a kind of mind-bending science fiction story. What I quite like about the book is that this mind-bending sci-fi comes across gradually. It's not something that's there right from the beginning. It reads at the beginning like it's a kind of near-future techno thriller, and gradually the science fiction kind of inhabits the story and the plot in some really nice ways. So the book is told in 3 unequal parts, and it's from multiple perspectives. So this is my first question for you, and I want you to put in the chat if you're watching and you've got comments on this, what you think about this. How well do you think this is done? We kind of get a very odd mix of first person and third person, and it moves in and out of them very fluidly, and between characters' perspectives very fluidly, almost kind of script-like, I thought. But yeah, that's the kind of the way it's told is by observing and hearing the thoughts of a kind of core set of characters who represent different perspectives. And we sometimes get all the details, and sometimes the author hides some of those details from us. And this is what the plot is. The plot is kicked off by 2 Americans arriving on this place, Silicon Isle, to sell this idea of a recycling plant, an industrial park, and progress, and cleaning up the mess that our technology addiction has caused. And then what happens next? What happens? What is already happening that they stumble into, and what their arrival and their actions contribute to as part of the story. So as I mentioned just then, you can add things in the chat, no matter where you are watching this, and I hope that you are watching it on either our Twitter feed or on our Facebook channel or on YouTube. You can add into the comments, and I'll be able to see them on my little screen that I've got down here, and bring them up, and I can add them to the screen so that everybody can see them, and we can kind of contribute to this conversation. So anything you want to add at any point, click in there. I'll see it on my little screen down here, and then we can bring it into the conversation and hopefully have a nice bit of back and forth. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the setting for this book, which is this kind of fictional place called Silicon Isle. It's fictional, but it's based in large part on somewhere that was very close to where our author grew up. And I'm going to put in the chat a link to this Flickr picture, if I can find it. So this is a picture of Guayu, which is a real-life Silicon Isle, basically. This is one of the places where a lot of the world's trash goes to be cleaned up and tidied up by the people that work and live there. As you can see, mountains of electronic waste that is shipped from Western countries mostly to be recycled and then kind of shipped somewhere else for reuse in China. And this was somewhere that the author saw build as build up as he was growing up, I suppose. He's 40 this year, so he'll have seen this development of the technological impact on his homeland. But this is a fictional one. It's not 100% an island, it's an isle where this trash in the near future is increasingly being put and sorted. I just want to read you a description by Stanley of the real life place that he grew up. Everything was shrouded in a leaden miasma, an amalgamation of the white mist generated by the boiling acarija in the acid baths and the black smoke from the unceasing burning of PVC, insulation and circuit boards in the fields and on the shore of the river. The two contrasting colours were mixed by the sea breeze until they could no longer be distinguished, seeping into the pores of every living being. So he already, I think, had in his mind this apocalyptic landscape of technological junk, trash, and the people that live there. And what a brilliant setting for a story, I think, because it makes us think about real life as well as what our future might be. And the people that we get in this story, we get a kind of core of characters who we follow most of the way through. The first one we meet is an American, Scott Brandel, who is there heading up this mission to sell this recycling dream to the people of Silicon Isle, to the government, to the clans that control it. We've got his translator, who is from Silicon Isle originally, Chen Qiufan, who we'll call Kaizong. So Chen is his family name, and he is a relation of one of these clans that helps run the island. We then have Mimi, who is a local girl who is caught up in the machinations, the schemes, and the action of the plot. We have Brother Wen, who is a kind of local leader and organiser on Silicon Isle of mysterious past. We have one of those clan leaders of the most powerful clan, Lao Jincheng. And then we also have another character, and this is a massive spoiler warning here. We have another Mimi. I don't want to talk too much about other Mimi yet, but I will be talking about it later. So if you don't want to know anything about other Mimi, definitely too much spoilers for you. And then we have a shadowy organisation that I'm kind of including as a character because I think the people that work for them are a little bit anonymous, and it's the organisation that matters, which is Colt's Foot Blossom, who is a kind of a Greenpeace equivalent, who are trying to raise awareness of climate issues and make change in the world. And what happens in this story is that the Americans try and kind of barge their way in. Kaizong falls in love, we think, possibly, with Mimi. Mimi has got a lot of stuff going on with her caused by technology, and she eventually kind of transcends into something else, into something different, and she becomes the obsession of all of the other characters. They all kind of want her for their own purposes, and she is the ignition for a very brief and bloody conflict between the three components of this isle. I thought it was just worth talking about these three components and what we think about them. So component one are the clans that run this island. In Western culture, they'd be equivalent of the mafia, essentially. They're never talked about as kind of triads here. They're just the families that have always run this island. And they run it by violence, by control of wealth and power. So they're a kind of, it's not a protection racket, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, I think. But they're the power. So Lin, Liao and Chen are those three clans who are kind of tussling for control with each other, but in a very rarefied place above everybody else. Then we have the natives, people from Silicon Isle, and one of our kind of lead characters, Kaizong, is one of those who've moved to America with his parents when he was young for a kind of a better life, and is now kind of, this is a bit of a homecoming for him. And then we have the migrant workers. So these are those who are called the kind of waste people. They're the ones who've come to Silicon Isle to do that dangerous work we saw in that real life picture of sorting through the trash. And there are tensions between these three levels, but mostly it's between the migrant workers and the people who were born and raised on Silicon Isle. So tell a wider story about how all of society deals with migrant workers and their effect on society. So I think that's enough of me talking about what this book is about. What I want to get onto is what I think the book is trying to say, or where I think the book is interesting. And this is where, if you've got things you want to contribute, now is a really good time. I can see there's some people watching, so if you've read the book and you've got things you want to drop into the chat, start doing so from now, I would say, if you've got anything to contribute. And what I've got on my little list here is some themes that I think this book is exploring, and then some things that I think are just worth talking about. And we've got about 40 minutes to kind of get through these before our hour is up. And through these, I think we'll tease out a bit more about what the book is and what it's about. And actually, I found it really easy to dig into what I think some of the themes of this book might be, and what I think some of the emerging ideas and concepts that are worth talking about will be. And that isn't always easy. I think Stanley Chan is a writer who is really interested in these overarching themes and exploring them through fiction. This came across really palpably. He likes the big ideas. And obviously that first one is about the environment and about our kind of eco-future and eco-justice. And the unfairness of the where we've got to now. So a world where mostly places like China, Taiwan, construct things out of electronic materials. They sell them to Western audiences. They pirate them themselves to sell for local audiences at a cheaper price. And there's a built-in redundancy for those, which means that they're chucked away. They end up back in the places where they're made to be recycled and then reused and added back on the conveyor belt. But this is not a perfect circle, so there is always waste, and that waste has to go somewhere. And this is the thing that we don't talk about in Western culture enough, which is about where that waste goes and what we do with it. We send it off for recycling, and we assume that it goes into a lovely perfect circle and then is all recycled and all wonderful. But that's just not the case. And later in the story, we get into a conversation about rare earth metals, and particularly the kind of Chinese story behind that. We hear quite a lot about Western Africa and rare earth metals, so it was interesting for me to hear about the kind of Chinese side of that, and how things that are rare, as the name suggests, and things that are complicated and difficult all have a price. Our technology, all of this technology I'm using, has a human and an ecological price, and we don't think about either of them. There are some broader, more general themes, which is probably the rest of the things on my list. So the first one that I've written down is about redemption. I think that quite a lot of the characters in this story are on redemptive paths. Either they've done something in the past that they're trying to atone for, or something has happened to them that they're looking to work through with action. So Scott, go back to that list of characters, Scott Brandel comes into this story with a tragedy in his past and a role that he plays in this kind of global environmental catastrophe, which he on some level is looking to atone for, but he hasn't entirely made that leap yet. He's got too many other motivating factors. And one thing that I want you to think about as you read this story or reread it is how much he represents American society and the wanting to be on that path to redemption, but are still tempted by greed and by power, and how that those two things form a bit of a cognitive dissonance, which American society and definitely Scott haven't found that balance yet. I think also Brother Wen has got a story about revenge and redemption. Kaizong has got an uneasy relationship with his homeland that he's trying to explore. There's lots of other links that I think you can make. So as you read the story, think about redemption and these redemption tales. It's also a story about loyalty and who you're loyal to. And I think allied with this, filial piety, this is the word I can't say, but kind of a respect for your elders and for your parents. And this is really represented by Kaizong, how his atheism relates to his parents' faith, and his complex relationships with the clans of Silicon Isle and who his allegiance is with. And this story is about some tipping points in allegiances. It's about making choices. Do you stick with your culture? Do you stick with your upbringing? Or do you identify who needs your support, who needs your allegiance, who needs your help, and align yourself with them? And what are the motivating factors for you to make that change, to make that leap? So I think that runs throughout here. Another thing that I picked up, and this is definitely because I did history as part of my university education, and I work in a heritage setting, is the idea of history. There's a quote that I picked out from quite early on in the story, which resonated a little bit with me in terms of this story, I think. All history is contemporary history. Now, I think if you'd have said a few years ago this phrase to people, it would have not meant anything at all. But over the last 5 years, especially when I think about conversations about the imperial legacy of the Western world, and if you think about the kind of re-evaluation of our pasts and how they affect our futures, this makes a lot more sense to me. And I think China and the glimpse of Chinese society and Chinese culture we get from this, all of that history is there in people's minds. People are carrying that history with them. It's there in the landscape, but it's also there in people's minds, in their relationships. Everything is tied into history. So I think to have Kaizong, who I would pitch as being the central character in the story, and we'll come on to why that's not Mimi a little bit later on. Having him being somebody that has been a student of history, I think, is key and a telling marker that this is what the author is thinking about. And we come into Silicon Isle, which is a society where people have history there on the Isle or they don't, and that is a dividing line. Your relationship to the Isle, whether you're a native or not, is an integral part of who has the power and who has the authority in this society. If you don't have a history, then you're seen as not worthy as anybody else. But Brother Wen is there to show that you can carry your history with you, and your secret history can actually be your power. I think the other thing that weaves into this is the origins of the organisation that Scott is working for, and how that is embedded in historical events that are echoing through time. So I also think this story is interested in innocence and complicity, and the way that these are drivers in our lives and the value that these things have to society. And I think these are both, at least the innocence is wrapped up with the character of Mimi and how she's presented and how she is talked about by, especially Kaizong, by that kind of main character. She's presented, he views her as an innocent in a complicated moral world, and when her innocence is altered, his relationship with her becomes difficult for him to pass, and I think that's quite something that's probably worth teasing out. I don't think I've got the answers for that one or theories necessarily. It was just a theme that emerged for me in my reading of this. There's also something there about agency and identity, but that probably comes into some of those earlier things that I've talked about. And then finally, and this links in with the history, I think, the tension between tradition and change, and the humanity of the exploited, and how maybe Chinese culture carries a lot of its cultural heritage and baggage with it, and it will do so into the future. And I think there's a lot here about ritual and about tradition and its power and its weight over rational thought, which I think the author seems to have a view on, or at least wants to explore the tension between. And we'll talk a bit about technology versus magic later on. I think that is a way that Stanley is interrogating some of this middle ground. So that's about half an hour of our time. We're about halfway through, and we've moved on to things that I thought we should chat about. So again, if you're sitting there watching this live or you're watching it back afterwards, drop your thoughts into the comments, because it'd be great to hear what you think. This is not in any order. I always make notes as I read, and I've kind of put them in as things were occurring to me. So we might just bounce back a little bit, back and forth between some of these, but I think you'll get where I'm coming from. So the first thing that occurred to me, and this was quite early in the story, was that what you don't often get in science fiction is a view of American culture from a non-Western perspective. And I think one of the interesting things about the rise of Asian genre writing, especially science fiction writing, is that you do get more of. We're getting more of this, and I think that's quite interesting. And I'd like to know what you think about that portrayal of American culture from somebody that hasn't necessarily been a part of Western culture and kind of lived and breathed it, but has visited and travelled and spoken to people, but also inhaled it through cultural artifacts, and how true to life we think this representation is, and how much we think that matters. So one of the passages which I absolutely loved was this one about food, and I'm going to read it in full because I chuckled at this, and I think it was also quite telling. Many of the dishes were far more complex and subtle than he had imagined. Of course, considering he came from a young country that had been founded only about 250 years ago, it was understandable that his own culinary culture had progressed but a few steps beyond tossing the meat over an open fire after skinning the kill, which I thought was hilarious. So we get this, we get Scott in this amazing kind of late night food market, just amazed by this kind of culinary adventure, this culinary experience, and all these flavours and things that he's kind of never heard and never seen, and how amazing they are. And this kind of, I think this speaks to a comment that throughout the novel, the Chinese culture we're given is deep and rich and full of nuance. We haven't even talked about language yet, which we're going to do in our next thing to discuss. But even the language of the people in the story is complex and rich and requires thought and experience. And the American kind of culture presented otherwise is very one note. I'm not sure how much I agree with this comment, considering that American culture is new, but it's founded on very old cultures from lots of other countries that are kind of brought together in this mixing pot. So I'm not sure Stanley's being entirely fair to Scott here, but by the same token, I think what is interesting is that perhaps this opens us up to think about how Chinese culture that's presented here has maintained complexity, whereas American culture or Western culture may be flattened out by scale. And whether that's fair or not, I think it's interesting. It's not the kind of thing you necessarily get from genre fiction very often. So it was really nice to kind of see it in this conversation. So let's get on to language, because we've not talked about language at all, which is a massive fail, really, considering that the book starts with a translator's note on languages and names. Now, I haven't read masses and masses of genre fiction in translation. Obviously, we've already done genre in translation as part of the book club this year, and it's something that I'm trying to do more and more of, which is part of the reason why Waste Tide was on my reading list. And I think there's something very interesting about how that works. The sense I get is that Ken Liu has produced an excellent translation for a Western reader, because not only do we get the story in our language, but I think there's also a subtle guide to us here of a culture that we don't know very well. And I get the sense that the translator has been able to be a help to English readers and to give us some guides to some of the things that are a little bit more complex about a culture especially I don't know personally, and we get some of those nuances. And that translator's note at the beginning, I thought, set the story up perfectly, and he was able to use the translator's note to give us a view of the society in which we were about to live and breathe for 400 pages. And one of the ways that he does this is he talks about a word I'd never heard, the topalects, and how this is different from a dialect. And I was fascinated by that kind of overarching structures of language in the society of which we're coming. Now, I know that in the original text, those nuances would have been even more pronounced, and there would have been a kind of richer experience picking up on how language is used, because I think even from in translation you get a sense that the language is incredibly important to this story. I think what the translator's note does and then the story does is it demonstrates how language is a signifier of the cultural and societal structures that this story is inhabiting. How you speak, the words you use, how you describe people, and the rules of that engagement and who breaks them and when are often markers of how people's attitudes, allegiances, identities are starting to change. And there is a whole conversation in the story which I found really interesting about attitudes towards Scott Brandle in particular, but also the way that the director Lin, who he deals with in this kind of negotiation, the way that he speaks, and that very obvious having to listen for subtext in what somebody's saying, and people not saying what they mean. And there are characters who say what they mean, they're kind of blunt about things, and the comparison between those two and what is good and what is bad, which I thought was all really, it added something to the story that I don't think we'd have got if it had been a Western writer writing this story. That nuance I thought was fascinating. It's something you don't often get, again, in genre fiction, I don't think. Next on my list, natives versus migrant workers. So, yeah, I thought this was quite interesting because the tensions between people who are from a place and people who move there for work, often low-paid work, it's a story as old as time. So it'd be good to know your thoughts on whether you think this was a story well told, or it was a story that was perhaps could have had a better result. I think it was I'm not sure it was the most nuanced telling of that kind of tale that I've come across, but I do think it was interesting, and there's going to be a sequel to this book, and I'm interested to see maybe how that story evolves based on what happens at the end of the novel. I think it's a lot more embedded in our psyches than maybe some of the solutions at the end of the story would suggest it is. But it's always a useful driver, I think, of tension in a story like this. So it made sense to me to be there. And it gave us some different perspectives, I think. And what it allowed the author to do was to use characters transitioning between those places and between those perspectives to show change in the society, or to signpost potential changes in society. I'm just going to make a little... So the next thing that I thought we might talk about is the tech. I'm kind of adding this in now because I've just been reflecting on it. So as I said at the start, this is a story which doesn't necessarily begin by feeling like a sci-fi story. And that ramps up slowly over time, which I thought worked quite effectively. And I was really interested by the use of kind of future technologies here. I'm not sure if I figured it out or made a note of when this story was supposed to be set. It's kind of near future-y, but it's not massively near future-y. So things have kind of moved on, but they've not moved on. I think what I realised towards the end is this is not a story necessarily set in our universe. It's in a slightly parallel one, where some things are the same, but some things aren't. I think this is interesting because it means that some of the technology that comes in, it might not be possible, but it's plausible. I think that's my view on the tech in this. But I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments of how you think the tech, how plausible you think the tech is. Because I think this is a story which has got pretensions about being hard sci-fi, but isn't necessarily 100% interested in doing that. And from someone that had worked for tech giants, there's going to be some interesting knowledge about what's coming there, which might have filtered into the story, which I think is quite cool. So yeah, what about the next thing on my little list? The next thing I've written down here is multiple perspectives. And I mentioned this earlier on. Even in that passage I read about the passage I read about Scott, I think there's an interesting voice that we get. We do get the inner thoughts of people, but we also get what's happening to them. So maybe it's an omnipotent narrator. And that could be an interesting thing to think about. I think if you're reading this, or you're reflecting on reading this, there is something we're not going to talk about today because there's not quite time, is religion and faith, and how that plays into this story. Because there is this wondering of characters about whether there is a guiding force for all of this. Is this fate? Is this a deity there who's pushing humanity on with all these triggers? And this is just the kind of narrative voice which you might expect from somebody who's got that omnipotence, I think. Is the omnipotence the cloud? Is it some kind of AI in orbit, perhaps, who can get into people's minds and see what's going on? I'm not sure that's entirely true. I'm not sure we're quite there with the tech in this time. But I do think there's the perspectives, multiple perspectives, maybe they've got a deeper resonance about other things that Stanley wants to talk about. The other thing I want to talk about was the tone. I thought this was a funny book. I thought there was a really funny streak of black comedy in it. The discussions about the money at the festival quite early on, and people and how people kind of pay money somewhere for something for their ancestors. Where does that money go? Who spends it? And how that's discussed. There's the bit about the food. There's a passage at the end which was another really streak of black comedy. I'd love to know your thoughts on how effective you thought that was. I think it speaks to the author's influences, which we're going to discuss quite near the end of this hour. I think the influences of some of those kind of particularly British writers, and how they incorporate black comedy into their science fiction, which isn't easy to do, and I think in this story is effective. On influences, I'm fascinated by a book I don't know well. Maybe more broadly, let's not talk about genre influences yet, but let's talk about cultural influences. So there is lots of culture that is discussed in this story. Chinese culture and Western culture. And I think the story, the author discusses all of them in a similar way, which I thought was brilliant. And I love stories that make me go and look up things I know nothing about. Stories I know nothing about, genres I know nothing about. And the more kind of Chinese genre work I read, the more I get to then discover about these kind of story arcs and narrative techniques and characters and themes which are coming through into modern fiction. But the one that stood out to me was a Western influence. I think it's partly because I know a little bit more about those stories than I do about others, and that was Dante's Inferno. And I made a note to myself as I was reading to kind of look up a little bit about how the Inferno might relate to this story. And I suppose my question is how surface it is. So Dante's Inferno is somebody's journey through the 9 circles of hell. So I suppose on one reading, maybe the references of Dante's Inferno is just to make the point that Silicon Isle is hell, and Scott, as our kind of never seen it before character, is entering the gates of hell. But I think there's a thematic element here as well, and if any of you want to do this, you might want to do this. I haven't got I wish I'd kind of read it with this in mind, because I think it would have been interesting to see if I could map how closely those 9 circles resemble the journey and the experiences of the characters in the story and the plot of the story. So there's the way that the circles work. They go limbo, greed, wrath, gluttony, heresy, violence, fraud, treachery, and there's lust in there somewhere as well. I think it's limbo, lust, greed, wrath, gluttony, heresy, violence, fraud, treachery. I can see in my mind's eye, as I think back to the plot of this story, that all of these things, apart from maybe, lust is in there, but I'm not sure it's as integral as the rest to the themes of the story. But I think these have got to be inspiration. These I think potentially relates to the experience of one character in particular, of Kaizong. He exists in a state of limbo about himself and about his relationship, his ambivalence to Silicon Isle. Greed is there in Scott and in the corporation that he's there representing. Wrath is in the story, and a lot of the main characters have moments where wrath is a motivating factor for them and they have to make a choice. Gluttony less so. Heresy is also tied up with Kaizong's story, his narrative, his journey, his relationship to his parents and faith, and to the rituals and faith of Silicon Isle and Chinese culture, and his place in that, and the heresy of going against clan culture. Violence and treachery are things done by and done to a substantial amount of the characters in the story, and fraud is there as well in some of the relationships between the clans and global governments, and the fraud done to the people that are drawn to Silicon Isle to work. So I think Dante's Inferno has got a lot to say about this story. I just haven't necessarily done all the unpicking yet of what that means. So we've also got another kind of overarching thing, which is this idea of the waste tide, which in the story is both literal in Project Waste Tide, but also metaphorical. And I like that kind of symbolism of there being a place in the world where all of the waste kind of goes up to, a kind of beach where it lands, but then right at the end of the novel, the waste tides that we're going to kind of come onto in the sequel and how that works. So I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments about where the waist tide fits. So let's move on to genre influences. And there's been some really interesting articles about Stan Lee and about his kind of cultural education in science fiction and fantasy. He grew up quite near Hong Kong, and I think this gave him a window when he was younger into the into Western science fiction tradition, both in books but also in films. And I think there's a few authors that this story reminded me of, possibly because they're influences on him, but also possibly because they came from the same earlier influences. I think there's definitely Richard Morgan and Neil Stephenson vibes going on here. And I realise I mentioned Neil Stephenson vibes quite a lot, but the story that it reminded me of partly was Cryptonomicon by Neil Stephenson, also set in Asia, and also about the global influence of Western society on Asia, the confluences of technology and money and power, and about the resonances of the Second World War and on contemporary society. And I think also the writing style has got definite techno info dumps and an appreciation of the right tech. I think both of these come from William Gibson to some degree, but I think that kind of techno thriller vibe is definitely a Stevenson thing, and also a Richard Morgan thing. I was thinking about Market Forces, I was thinking about some of his other works that you all know of, and also I suppose with Richard Morgan, the body and identity and consciousness and the replacing of body parts or replacing of bodies is something that he's been quite interested in. The other authors that come up, or the filmmakers that come up, are or the confluence of the two is probably Arthur C. Clarke, both in his fiction but also in the watching of films like 2001. And there's two areas here which I think are worth discussion, one of which is Clarke's laws. I don't know if you know Clarke's laws. The third law is very famous. I think the second and third have got some bearing here on this story. So the first law is, when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he's almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he's probably wrong. I don't think this has a bearing on the story. But the second law, the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. I think that is definitely something this story is interested in, and is something that the plot is interested in. But it's that third law which is referenced quite directly in the story. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And this is a clear thing for me in this story. It's kind of, it's actually mentioned in the story. It's kind of said in a slightly different way, but it's there. And I think that scene of the oil burning is a commentary on how that tension between ritual belief and technology, and how technology can be used as a way of defrauding people, thinking that it's a religious or a spiritual moment, but also potentially how those things are going to clash more and more over time as technology not only reveals the secrets of the universe, but also does things that magic couldn't even dream of. What have I got left on my little list? A few things which I want you to consider, I suppose. Oh, before I go, actually, there is one more thing on Arthur C. Clarke, and that is the psychedelia and the kind of hallucinatory, visionary elements of this story. There are long patches here where people go on these kind of mind-bending moments. There's these things called digital mushrooms. People have trips. And yeah, I think that's 2001 spoke very strongly to me. That end of 2001 in particular was seen to be a massive influence on this story and that kind of mind-bending element. Let me know what you think. I've got two things left on my little list, which I want you, three things left on my list, which I want you to think about. One of which I looked up was the Arashio, the Japanese destroyer. That was real, that really happened. Bear that in mind when you read the story. The second is TerraCycle, and that company and its motivations, which we've not mentioned before. It occurred to me that TerraCycle could be seen as a commentary on the historic companies and their effect on Asia, the East India Company as being a kind of famous example, but also a way into China's relationship with the world in a post-imperial world, and also I think about there's an interesting thing there about identity and this idea of a global citizen, which Kaizong represents, I think, the mix of Chinese and American cultures and being uneasy in both. And I think that's referenced in the use of cultural artifacts of Chinese and Western cultures, and that this story, this place, some of the characters within it maybe are emblematic of this place we're at now, and the unease we're at now, and the imbalance in power we're in now with this idea of global citizenship, and who is a global citizen and what does it mean, and what are those cultural markers of it. So that's something that I want you to go and think about. Okay, the last thing is Mimi's story arc, and I wanted to do this last not because it's not important, because it's really important, but because it's something that I want you to go away and think about as you read the novel, as you reread the novel, as you reflect on your reading of it. I'd already written a note about Mimi's story arc and her as a character in general. So, and whether I thought that she was effectively written or not. And in the prep for this, I read the Tor.com review of Waist Tide, which as a kind of examination of its sci-fi-ness and of how it's written is generally very positive. But the author of the review had a real problem with the treatment of women and Mimi in particular in the story. And I'm going to read a bit of this review because I think otherwise I'm just going to paraphrase it. This is not a book that passes the Bechdel test in any meaningful fashion. I'm not sure what's going on with Mimi, but she seems more like a cipher than a human being most of the time. And the more power she has to affect things, the more helpless she seems to be as herself. It's not her that has the power, but something within her, something using her. At times she seems to be something of a MacGuffin, more symbol than character. I could be biased on this point. I'm not inclined to be generous to a novel that has graphically depicted torture and kind of violation and the death of a sister as motivation for a male character's life choices, and the death of a daughter as explanation for another's trauma and emotional deficits, or a book that concludes, and this is spoilers, by giving its only major female character brain damage that reduces her to the capacities of a child. There are multiple and distinctive male characters in Waist Tide. The same isn't true for women. And I think this is something that I struggled with as I was reading the story, was where women featured or didn't feature and how effective they were. And there's something complex here, I think, that the review doesn't talk about, which is the other Mimi. I'm not going to get into it because that is probably too spoilery. Who the other Mimi is, why they're interesting, and why they're quite a unique character in this story. By some measure, I think you can argue that the story does pass the Bechdel test because of the two Mimis, but also not. And I'm uncomfortable, I think, with Mimi's arc. She's quite often a pawn for men. And I don't know how much this is the author's views or if it's the author's commentary on the society of which she's talking about. I think sometimes it can be both and sometimes neither, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think that there is violence towards men as well, but it's not the same kind of violence, and I found that problematic. And I think if the story was maybe written today, even 8 years on from when it was written, maybe it would be written a little bit differently based on the conversations that society have had over the last few years. I'd hope so, as society would start to interrogate this trope, but it is problematic, I think. I think the story is still really interesting and very well written, and I really enjoyed it, but I think it's something that you have to take away and and reflect on yourself. I don't think it's a straightforward answer. The choice of who the other Mimi is, I thought was really, really interesting. Again, I'm being careful to not spoil here, because I think it's a real mind-bending reveal. And if you know nothing about who that character is in real life, it's not necessarily going to mean anything until you go and do a little bit of research. And I don't know whether that was the author being aware of the treatment of Mimi and how Mimi is often a bit of a cipher and a bit of an odd character and a bit of a redress to that, or it's to put into stark relief that kind of trope of the innocent girl who's mistreated and is a pawn for men's machinations. So leave in the comments your views on that and what you think, because it's a complex, difficult question to get at, I think. And I'd love to continue this dialogue with you, I think, in the comments over the next, 10 years. You've got as long as you want to comment, really. So that's a weird place to end, I think, but an important place to end. And an important place to end as we start thinking about here at Cosmia, Casa Cosmia, about the festival and what our programme is going to look like and is going to address over the next few months. As ever, you can help support Cosmia Festival, help us pay the bills, keep the lights on, by clicking on that Ko-Fi link that is on screen and donating to our Ko-Fi fund. You can access a list of all the books that we're talking about in the book club, purchase them through a local bookstore, and give us a little bit of revenue as well by clicking on our bookshop link, which I'll leave in the comments of the edited YouTube video, but you can also find it on our website and on our social media. And we hope to see you for the next book club, for another interesting conversation about a book that we love. Stay safe, and we will see you soon.